Most people believe Microsoft professionals get hired because they know how to use Microsoft tools. They are wrong. Enterprises hire Microsoft professionals because they solve the only problem that actually matters to the board, which is managing governance complexity at scale. The labor market does not reward tool operators who simply click buttons in a portal, but instead favors system orchestrators who understand how these pieces fit together. The entire Microsoft stack, including Entra ID, Power Platform, Azure, and Fabric, is architected to make this orchestration deterministic. This is not a matter of opinion or marketing, but a structural economic reality that dictates who gets the job and who gets ignored. Over the next 90 minutes, we will examine why the market systematically favors professionals who view identity as the control plane and governance as the primary business layer. We will break down the specific certifications that signal this high-level thinking, the case studies that prove these concepts work in the real world, and the skill sequences that accelerate your hiring velocity. By the time we finish, you will understand why a Microsoft architect walks into a hiring conversation with a level of leverage that cloud generalists simply do not possess. That distinction matters because it changes how you position your value to an organization. The event. Enterprise complexity has become unbearable. Enterprises are no longer monolithic entities that live inside a single data center. They now span on-premises infrastructure, AWS workloads, Azure services, and a massive sprawl of SaaS applications that create governance friction at every single boundary. The traditional IT operating model has effectively collapsed under its own weight, which means perimeter security and centralized infrastructure no longer work because work now happens everywhere. Identities are forced to span multiple disconnected directories, while data lives in incompatible systems that don't talk to each other, creating a landscape of fragmented information. Regulatory pressure has intensified to a point where compliance is a constant state of anxiety. Between GDPR, HIPAA, SOX, and newer frameworks like NIS2 or DORA, every organization is buried under layers of required visibility and auditable controls. The average enterprise now operates 5 to 7 different identity systems simultaneously, often running on-premises Active Directory for legacy systems alongside Okta for specific apps and AWS IAM for cloud workloads. This creates a mess of custom applications with credential stores and third-party SaaS tools that have massive federation gaps. This fragmentation creates a massive amount of operational debt that eventually comes due. Access reviews that should take days end up taking months, and offboarding processes often leave orphaned accounts scattered across various systems like digital ghosts. Incident response becomes a form of digital archaeology where you spend your time tracing which identity system actually owns a compromised user, which means you end up cross-referencing logs that were never designed to communicate while you wait for answers that may never come. Security teams are currently drowning because they cannot correlate signals across these disparate systems. Compliance auditors are constantly demanding proof that controls are actually working, while executives look at vendor bills that should have been consolidated years ago. The spreadsheets multiply, and the policy exceptions accumulate until the debt becomes unmanageable, which is the uncomfortable truth of the modern enterprise. They are losing control of their own environments. The market response to this chaos is entirely predictable. Enterprises are willing to pay a massive premium for professionals who can actually reduce this complexity. They are not looking for people who want to add another tool to the pile or implement a narrow point solution, but instead want professionals who can consolidate the stack and make governance deterministic instead of reactive. This is the event that has changed the hiring landscape forever. This is the specific constraint that the labor market is actually optimizing for right now. It isn't about infrastructure speed or having the most features, but rather the ability to manage governance complexity. Companies want the ability to move from 5 identity systems down to 1, and they want to replace manual access reviews with automated workflows. They need to move away from incident response archaeology and toward a model of real-time detection and response. The Microsoft stack is architected precisely to solve this specific problem. It is not a collection of point solutions or a suite of independent tools, but rather an integrated governance plane. Identity sits at the very foundation of this architecture, and everything else derives from that single point of truth. Security, compliance, automation, and analytics all flow through the identity layer. This architectural coherence creates a massive hiring advantage for those who understand it. When an enterprise is drowning in complexity, they do not need another isolated specialist, nor do they need an infrastructure engineer or a security analyst working in a vacuum. They need a professional who understands how Entra ID connects to Power Platform governance and how those connections feed into Fabric security and Defender incident response. That professional is incredibly rare, and that rarity commands significant leverage in the hiring market. While AWS and Google Cloud have identity capabilities, those services are not the center of gravity for those platforms. In those ecosystems, infrastructure is the priority, and professionals there optimize for speed rather than governance coherence. And this is not a weakness in those platforms, but rather a different architectural priority and a different market position. The successful Microsoft professional understands a fundamental truth about the industry. In regulated hybrid enterprises, governance complexity is the primary constraint. Speed and infrastructure are secondary concerns compared to the need for reducing governance friction. The Microsoft stack is architected to make that reduction systematic, and that understanding is exactly what separates the hired from the ignored. Why Microsoft architecture fits this problem? The Microsoft stack is not a collection of point solutions, and treating it like a bundle of separate tools is the first mistake most architects make. It is designed as an integrated governance plane where identity is the foundation rather than a secondary feature. Everything else you care about, including security, compliance, and automation, derives its authority from that single point. Most organizations treat Entra ID as a simple identity provider, but they are fundamentally wrong about its purpose. In reality, Entra ID is a distributed decision engine that evaluates every access request and logs every policy decision in real time. This creates deterministic governance at scale, allowing you to define a policy once and watch it propagate across the entire environment. When you disable a user in Entra ID, their access is revoked across AWS, Azure, and your SaaS applications simultaneously, and this coherence is architectural rather than a feature you bolt on after the fact. Power Platform sits directly on top of this identity foundation to ensure that citizen developers cannot build workflows that bypass your controls. Every app and every automation inherits the existing governance layer, which represents architectural enforcement rather than mere policy theater. You do not need a separate data loss prevention tool for this environment because DLP is already embedded in the connectors and the flow execution model. A user cannot accidentally route sensitive data to an unapproved destination because the platform itself prevents the action from occurring. Azure integrates with Entra through role-based access control and conditional access to ensure that workloads never exist without identity context. This means your infrastructure decisions are always tied to your governance decisions, and you cannot even spin up a virtual machine without assigning it an identity first. You are prevented from granting access to that machine without passing through Entra policies because infrastructure and identity are no longer separate domains, and they have been unified into a single control plane. Fabric consolidates your data and analytics under this same model so that security and audit trails are baked into the platform itself. And when a user queries a dataset in Fabric, the system evaluates their access against Entra ID policies and logs the interaction immediately. The analytics layer does not exist outside of your governance, it exists entirely within it. Defender then integrates across these layers to track signals from endpoints, identities, and applications through a unified pipeline. When the system detects a compromised credential, Defender correlates that signal with endpoint telemetry and data exfiltration patterns to show you the complete picture. The security team can see the full scope of an attack because the architecture provides that visibility by default. This architectural coherence creates a structural hiring advantage that is far from theoretical. When an enterprise is drowning in governance complexity, they do not need another point solution specialist to manage a single tool. They need a professional who understands how Entra ID connects to Power Platform governance and how those connections impact Fabric security and Defender incident response. That specific professional is rare, and that rarity is exactly what creates career leverage. AWS and Google Cloud certainly have identity capabilities, but identity is not the center of gravity in those ecosystems. Infrastructure is the priority for AWS, while data and machine learning drive Google Cloud, leaving identity as a supporting system. In the Microsoft stack, identity is the control plane that everything else orbits, which is not a weakness in other clouds, but rather a different architectural priority and a different market position. The Microsoft professional understands that in regulated hybrid enterprises, governance complexity is the primary constraint. It is not about infrastructure speed or feature richness, but the ability to move from 5 identity systems down to 1. You are being paid for the ability to move from manual access reviews to automated ones, and from incident archaeology to real-time detection. You must be able to prove to auditors that your controls are working continuously rather than just scrambling to fix things during an audit window. The Microsoft stack is architected to make that reduction of complexity systematic rather than just aspirational. That specific understanding is what separates the people who get hired from the people who get ignored. It gives a Microsoft architect a level of leverage in a hiring conversation that a cloud generalist simply cannot match. The first case study, Entra-led Zero Trust transformation. Let's look at how this architectural thinking plays out in a real-world scenario involving a mid-market enterprise with hybrid infrastructure. This company was running AWS workloads alongside Azure virtual machines and on-premises legacy servers, while their SaaS applications were scattered across multiple identity systems. Okta managed some apps, local Active Directory managed others, and AWS IAM handled the cloud workloads, which meant they had no unified MFA strategy and no consistent way to enforce device compliance. The problem here was not a lack of technical tools, but a fundamental architectural failure. There was no single source of truth for identity, so access reviews required querying multiple systems and manually cross-referencing spreadsheets. Offboarding was always incomplete because some systems were never notified when a user left the company. When an employee was terminated, their account might be disabled in one directory while remaining active and dangerous in 3 others, and incident response was slow because identity signals were fragmented. When a Microsoft professional enters this environment, they do not propose adding yet another tool to the pile. They do not suggest simply configuring Okta better or spending more time in AWS IAM. Instead, they propose centralizing identity into Entra ID as the sole source of authority for the entire organization. They federate AWS under Entra policies, sync the on-premises directory via Entra Connect, and implement conditional access to enforce MFA uniformly, which is an architectural restructuring that replaces VPN dependency with an identity-first access model. This process requires mapping every single workload to an identity policy and defining what trusted actually means across hybrid boundaries. You have to build approval workflows that respect governance requirements while still allowing the business to move at a reasonable speed. It requires training teams on a fundamentally different security model that is based on identity rather than a network perimeter. The implementation usually takes 6 to 9 months, but the outcomes are immediate and measurable. Access-related incidents typically drop by 40%, and the time spent preparing for audits falls from 8 weeks down to 4. Offboarding becomes a fully automated process where disabling a user in Entra ID revokes their access across AWS, Azure, and SaaS systems simultaneously. In this case, the enterprise saved $300,000 in annual licensing fees by consolidating their identity stack. They reduced the manual workload for the security team by 50 hours every quarter and achieved a state of continuous audit readiness. Compliance became an operational reality that lived in the code rather than a checkbox that people dreaded every few months. Most importantly, the organization moved from a fragmented identity model to a deterministic one where governance is baked into the infrastructure. Every new workload and every new user automatically inherits the same set of policies and audit requirements. The system does not forget to remove access, and it does not allow exceptions to accumulate and create security debt over time. This is exactly why the Microsoft professional was hired in the first place. They weren't there to deploy MFA or treat Entra ID as a standalone tool. They were there to restructure the enterprise perimeter. That is orchestration, and that is what the market is willing to pay a premium for. The hiring advantage here is concrete and easy to see. When a CISO interviews a security architect, they want to know if that person can design a federated identity model that consolidates governance across a multi-cloud environment. A Microsoft professional with an SC100 certification and this case study in their portfolio has a clear, proven answer. They understand the architecture, they understand the trade-offs, and they can point to the specific outcomes. A cloud generalist without this specific experience might understand AWS, IAM, or Okta implementation deeply, but they often lack the bigger picture. They do not understand how to make identity the control plane for an entire enterprise or how to move from reactive compliance to deterministic governance. That specific architectural thinking is what the market is actually hiring for, and it is what gives you the most leverage in any hiring conversation. The second case study, Power Platform Governance at Scale. Let me show you a different set of constraints that lead to the same fundamental problem in a completely different domain. This enterprise employs 15,000 knowledge workers, and right now citizen developers are building applications without any oversight at all. SharePoint customizations are piling up and creating massive technical debt, while rogue SaaS subscriptions sit scattered across various departments. There is zero visibility into automation workflows, and while data loss prevention policies technically exist, nobody is actually enforcing them. Governance in this environment is purely reactive, which means the team is always chasing fires instead of preventing them. The problem here is not the fact that citizen development is happening, but rather that it is happening without any architectural guardrails. Apps are being built in isolated environments, and workflows are accessing sensitive data without a single control in place to stop them. There is no inventory of what exists and no understanding of where data is flowing, so when an audit eventually arrives, the IT team has to scramble to discover what was actually built. They inevitably find applications moving regulated data to unapproved cloud services, alongside workflows that bypass every approval process the company has. These are automations that nobody documented and nobody truly understands, creating a landscape of pure architectural erosion. A Microsoft professional looks at this chaos and proposes a Power Platform Center of Excellence, which is not a governance committee or a review board designed to slow people down. It is an architectural framework that includes a standardized environment model with sandboxes for experimentation and controlled areas for building. This system uses role-based access control integrated directly with Entra ID, and it enforces data loss prevention policies at the connector level. By implementing application lifecycle management for version control and a real-time governance dashboard, the professional gains full visibility into the app inventory and compliance status. The implementation of this framework happens in a phased approach to ensure the system remains stable. During month 1, the team audits the existing environment to discover what exists and map out every data flow to identify high-risk applications. Month 2 is spent designing the governance model, which involves defining approved connectors and building the approval workflows for production deployment. By month 3, they implement environment segregation and begin migrating applications, and month 4 is when they finally enforce the DLP policies to stop sensitive data from reaching unapproved destinations. Finally, in month 5, they establish the Center of Excellence team to take over the day-to-day governance operations. The outcomes of this structured approach are measurable and immediate. 300 internal applications are finally cataloged and rationalized, and the team eliminates 50 redundant SaaS subscriptions, which saves the company $150,000 every year. Because citizen developers can now self-serve within established guardrails, the IT backlog for small automation requests drops by 35%. Compliance incidents effectively drop to 0 because the platform itself prevents sensitive data from flowing to the wrong places. This is the insight that separates a Microsoft professional from a generalist, because this case study proves that governance and speed are not actually opposites. The professional does not restrict innovation. They enable it at scale by removing friction and preventing the need for constant rework. A citizen developer working inside a governed framework actually builds faster because they no longer have to wait for manual approvals. The framework handles the approval automatically, and the developer can focus on the build without worrying about compliance because the platform enforces it. They spend less time debugging data flows because the system is designed to prevent misconfiguration from the start. This is architectural thinking rather than bureaucratic or security theater thinking, and the professional who understands this distinction commands massive leverage in any hiring conversation. When the chief business operations officer at an enterprise like this interviews automation architects, they always ask how to govern 500 developers without killing innovation. A Microsoft professional with a PL600 certification and a Center of Excellence implementation in their portfolio has a concrete answer ready to go. They can show the framework and explain the trade-offs while predicting exactly how the outcomes will look. They are able to demonstrate that governance scales, while a generalist without this specific experience simply cannot. A generalist might understand low-code platforms or the general concept of citizen development, but they do not understand how to scale governance without creating massive bottlenecks. They have no idea how to make developers productive within constraints or how to move from reactive compliance to a deterministic governance model at the application layer. This is exactly why Microsoft professionals are hired faster than anyone else. They do not just understand the tools, they understand the governance models required to make complexity systematic rather than chaotic. That specific understanding is what the market is actually paying for. The third case study, Fabric and Sentinel consolidation. I want to show you one more domain where this architectural advantage becomes obvious. Imagine an enterprise running a security operations center that uses Splunk for log aggregation and a completely separate Power BI instance for executive dashboards. They have separate tools for compliance reporting and different systems for tracking incidents, which means there is no unified view of risk anywhere in the company. When a security incident occurs, an analyst has to manually correlate signals by querying Splunk and checking a separate tracker before pulling data from a third system. This is not actual security analysis, it is just data archaeology. The core problem here is fragmentation, where every system has its own data model, its own access controls, and its own isolated audit trail. When a security event happens, the analyst never sees the complete picture because the evidence is scattered across a dozen incompatible systems. If a compromised credential is detected, the analyst does not immediately know which applications were accessed or what data was touched. They have no idea which compliance controls were triggered, so they are forced to manually connect the dots while the clock is ticking. A Microsoft professional does not suggest adding another tool to the pile, but instead proposes a total consolidation of the security stack. They migrate the security telemetry into Microsoft Sentinel and use Fabric for analytics, which allows them to align identity logs directly with governance policy. This creates a unified incident response workflow that traces a path from Defender alerts through Entra logs and into Sentinel investigations. By the time the data reaches the Fabric dashboards, the entire story of the breach is already connected and visible. This implementation requires a complete rethinking of how data pipelines function within the organization. Security events that used to flow into Splunk are redirected to Sentinel, where they are correlated with Entra identity events in real time. When the system detects an anomalous login, Sentinel automatically enriches that signal with the context of the conditional access policy. The system asks if the device was compliant and if the access pattern was normal, while Fabric dashboards visualize the incident within a business context. The security team finally sees the complete picture because the architecture is designed to provide it. The measurable outcomes of this consolidation are significant. Incident triage time drops from 2 hours down to just 30 minutes because all the relevant data lives in one single system. Executive dashboards now update in real time instead of once a day, and compliance reporting is fully automated because the audit trails are continuous. On top of the operational improvements, the enterprise saves $400,000 in annual licensing costs by moving away from Splunk. More importantly, the security team can now operate with deterministic visibility instead of wondering if they missed a piece of the puzzle. The system is built so that every security-relevant data point flows through a unified pipeline, which means governance and security are no longer separate functions. When the CISO asks if a compromise was detected, the answer is no longer a vague promise to check 5 different systems. The answer is immediate because the system has already correlated every signal and provided the conclusion. This is architectural thinking in action, and the professional who can execute this level of consolidation commands the highest leverage in the market. When a chief information security officer interviews architects, they want to know how to integrate identity, endpoint, and data signals into one platform. A Microsoft professional with an SC100 certification and Sentinel Fabric experience can answer that question with a complete architectural plan. They can explain how identity signals enrich an investigation and demonstrate how governance and security become one unified motion. They can predict the operational wins because they have seen how the architecture behaves under pressure. A security specialist who was only trained on point solutions will struggle to keep up in this conversation. They might know Splunk inside and out, but they do not understand how to make identity the foundation of the entire security operation. They do not know how to consolidate fragmented systems or move from manual correlation to deterministic detection. This case study proves that the Microsoft professional's advantage extends far beyond simple identity management. It covers the entire governance and security stack, and the person who understands how identity connects to analytics is the one who gets hired first. The fourth case study, endpoint and identity collapse. Most organizations still view the network as their primary security boundary, but this case study proves that the perimeter has already dissolved into nothing. Consider an enterprise with a distributed workforce relying on legacy VPN infrastructure and inconsistent device trust. They have zero visibility into which hardware is touching corporate resources as users move between home offices, coffee shops, and co-working spaces. While a BYOD policy technically exists, it remains unenforced, and that leads to security incidents that trace back to compromised personal devices that should never have been granted network access in the first place. The traditional response is to double down on perimeter thinking by strengthening the VPN tunnel. Architects suggest adding multi-factor authentication, implementing pre-connection device scanning, or mandating specific endpoint protection to fix the problem. This approach assumes that controlling the network boundary equals controlling security, but in a world where work happens everywhere, the VPN is no longer a perimeter. It has become a bottleneck that creates a false sense of safety while failing to address the underlying risk of the device itself. A Microsoft professional recognizes that the solution is not a better VPN, but a different architectural model entirely. They propose replacing VPN dependency with identity-first access by deploying Intune to manage the entire fleet of corporate and personal hardware. By implementing conditional access policies, the system evaluates device health, user identity, and application sensitivity in real time. Access is no longer granted based on where a user is sitting, but rather on the specific risk context of that moment, marking the transition from perimeter-based security to a true zero-trust model. Executing this shift requires a fundamental change in how the organization views its assets. The first step involves taking a full inventory and enrolling every corporate device into Intune to enforce strict compliance standards. Encryption becomes mandatory, password requirements are strictly enforced, and operating system versions must remain current with active endpoint protection. For personal devices, the architect implements Intune app protection policies, and this ensures that corporate data stays secure even when the underlying hardware is not fully managed by the company. The second phase centers on the enforcement mechanism of conditional access. The architect defines compliant as a state where the device is enrolled, encrypted, and running active protection on a modern operating system. When a user attempts to reach a sensitive application, the system evaluates these signals instantly. If the device fails to meet the bar, the user is not simply blocked, but they are prompted to remediate the issue by updating their software or enabling security features. This is not a restrictive policy, but rather an enablement strategy that uses automated guardrails to maintain a known state of security. Once these controls are live, the organization can finally retire its aging VPN infrastructure. Users no longer need a specialized tunnel to reach corporate resources because they authenticate directly through Entra ID. Because access is granted based on identity and device health rather than network location, the enterprise eliminates the cost and complexity of the old model. When the VPN capacity is reduced, infrastructure costs typically drop by about 30%, and the incident response team gains immediate clarity through logs that tie every access event to a specific device context. This architectural shift changes the very nature of how the enterprise handles a compromise. So when an incident occurs, the team can immediately see which devices were affected and which specific applications were accessed by impacted users. Remediation happens faster because non-compliant devices are automatically isolated by the system, and this prevents a user from accidentally connecting with an unprotected machine. The perimeter is no longer a firewall sitting in a data center because the perimeter is now the identity of the user and the health of their endpoint. The structural advantage in the hiring market becomes clear when a chief technology officer looks for a new infrastructure architect. They ask how to move the organization away from the dying perimeter model toward identity-based security. A Microsoft professional who has earned their MS 102 certification and managed Intune conditional access deployments can answer this with authority. They have lived through the migration, they understand the trade-offs of BYOD, and they know how to manage a unified governance framework. An infrastructure specialist who spent their career on firewalls and VPNs cannot compete in this conversation. They might understand the deep mechanics of packet filtering or the theory of device compliance, but they lack the vision to make identity the new perimeter. They do not know how to enable a distributed workforce without sacrificing control. The professional who understands that conditional access is the primary enforcement mechanism is rare, and that rarity translates directly into leverage during a hiring conversation. The fifth case study, licensing rationalization as architecture. The final case study demonstrates why a Microsoft professional commands leverage by focusing on the intersection of architecture and finance. Many enterprises find themselves paying for a fragmented mess of identity and security tools. They might use Okta for identity, Duo for MFA, and separate vendors for data loss prevention and cloud access security brokers. With an annual spend of $2.8 million, the overlap is massive, the visibility is fragmented, and governance decisions are made in isolated silos. A typical procurement response is to audit the licenses to see which tools are underutilized or where costs can be trimmed. While this might save some money, it fails to address the underlying architectural rot of operating 5 disconnected systems. The security team is still forced to correlate signals manually and manage multiple consoles, which means the governance model remains fundamentally broken. A cost-cutting exercise is not a solution for a system that lacks a unified brain. A Microsoft professional approaches this as an architectural audit rather than a procurement task. They map every security requirement to the native capabilities of the Microsoft stack, replacing the fragmented tools with a consolidated engine. Identity and MFA move to Entra ID, while Purview handles data loss prevention and Intune manages the endpoints. Threat detection and incident response are centralized in Defender and Sentinel, and this is not just a way to reduce the number of vendors, but a way to build a coherent system where every component talks to the others. The financial reality of this consolidation is often startling. A Microsoft E5 license costs about $120 per user annually, while the fragmented stack it replaces often costs closer to $180. However, the real value is found in the systemic governance that emerges when everything is built on Entra ID. When a user is disabled in the identity provider, they are instantly removed from every connected system, and when a device fails a compliance check in Intune, conditional access immediately restricts its access to sensitive data. This level of automation eliminates the need for 5 separate governance workflows. When Purview detects a data exfiltration attempt, it can automatically notify Sentinel to trigger an incident response playbook without human intervention. The implementation of this model usually takes 6 to 9 months, but the result is a massive reduction in the operational burden on the security team. They no longer have to reconcile conflicting policies across disconnected platforms because they are operating on a single unified control plane. The financial outcome is significant, often dropping the annual spend from $2.8 million to $1.6 million. That $1.2 million in savings is impressive, but the real win is the shift toward deterministic governance. A cost-cutting generalist sees this as a way to save money on software, but the Microsoft professional sees it as a way to eliminate architectural erosion. They understand that consolidation is valuable because it makes the entire system coherent and predictable. When a CFO asks how to reduce the security spend while improving the organization's posture, the Microsoft professional has the answer. With an SC100 certification and experience in licensing rationalization, they can present a financial model that is backed by architectural logic. They can predict exactly how operational efficiency will improve once the fragmentation is gone. They demonstrate that consolidation is not just about the bottom line, but it is about creating a system that can actually be governed. A generalist who lacks this specific experience cannot provide that level of certainty. They might understand vendor management or basic procurement, but they do not know how to turn 5 separate systems into one deterministic platform. They cannot explain how to move from reactive compliance to a model where security is enforced by the architecture itself. This is why the market pays a premium for the Microsoft professional who understands that cost optimization is merely a side effect of good design. The professional who realizes that the market is paying for architectural thinking, not just tool expertise, is the one who gets hired first. They command leverage because they can solve the financial problem and the security problem simultaneously. In their hands, the licensing layer becomes a tool for governance, and this ensures that the organization is not just spending less, but is actually more secure. This is the ultimate advantage of the Microsoft professional, the ability to turn complex licensing into a streamlined, defensible architecture. The reasoning layer. Why governance complexity is the constraint. Most enterprise hiring decisions are driven by a cold, simple economic principle. Companies pay for the reduction of constraints. To understand the market, you have to identify the actual bottleneck. In the current landscape, that constraint is no longer infrastructure speed because Azure and AWS can both provision resources at roughly the same velocity. The real friction point is governance complexity. This complexity usually reveals itself as identity fragmentation, where an organization struggles with multiple directories and disconnected authentication protocols. Without a single source of truth, compliance becomes a source of friction rather than a standard, leading to manual audit preparation and agonizingly slow evidence collection. Security visibility gaps open up because signals are scattered across too many systems, creating massive operational overhead for teams trying to manage manual access reviews and offboarding. When you see vendor sprawl and overlapping tools, you aren't looking at technical glitches. You are looking at architectural failures. You cannot fix an architectural collapse with a point solution because these problems require integrated systems to resolve. The Microsoft stack is specifically built to collapse this governance complexity into something manageable. Entra ID serves as the foundation, and every other capability in the ecosystem derives its authority from that single point. Whether you are looking at security, automation, or analytics, the goal is to create a deterministic governance model. When you define an identity policy within Entra, that intent propagates naturally to Power Platform governance, Intune compliance, and Defender security. One policy reaches out to multiple enforcement points, ensuring that your source of truth remains consistent and your outcomes stay predictable. This architectural coherence creates a massive advantage for the person who knows how to wield it. Enterprises don't actually need another infrastructure engineer to spin up virtual machines, but they are desperate for a professional who understands how to reduce governance complexity across the entire stack. That specific skill set is rare, and in a competitive market, that professional is always the one who gets hired first. The reward for this expertise is easy to measure in the labor market. A Microsoft architect who holds an SC100 certification and can prove they've consolidated governance usually commands a salary premium of 15 to 25% over a standard cloud generalist. This isn't because the Microsoft specialist is inherently smarter than their peers, but rather because they are solving a much more expensive problem. Governance complexity costs a company millions in operational waste, security incidents, and the inevitable failures that come with manual audit processes. When you reduce this complexity, you are effectively solving a multi-million-dollar problem for the business. The market recognizes that value, it pays for that value, and it hires specifically for that value. The reasoning here is quite clear once you look past the branding. Enterprises aren't hiring Microsoft professionals because they have a deep affection for the brand. They hire them because the architecture allows for governance consolidation. That consolidation is worth millions in terms of operational efficiency and the speed at which a company can meet its compliance obligations. If you understand that your value lies in reducing governance friction rather than just deploying tools, you have a structural advantage in any interview. You can walk into a room and tell a hiring manager that you don't just deploy Entra ID, but instead you restructure identity architecture to eliminate complexity. That is a completely different conversation, and it's one where you hold all the leverage. This logic extends directly into how you should view your certification strategy. The SC100 is not actually a security certification in the traditional sense. It is a governance architecture certification. The exam tests your ability to design strategies that weave together identity, operations, and data across hybrid environments. This is systems thinking, and it requires you to act as an orchestrator rather than a technician. Similarly, the MS-102 isn't just about managing endpoints. It is an identity and endpoint integration exam that forces you to understand how the modern workplace functions as a single integrated system. You aren't just managing devices, you are ensuring that identity governance and data security are baked into the very fabric of the organization. The PL600 follows the same pattern, as it isn't really a Power Platform exam but a process governance certification. It evaluates whether you can design solutions that allow thousands of citizen developers to innovate without breaking the company's security or operational coherence. It is about enabling creativity within a set of rigid deterministic constraints. The professional who recognizes this distinction understands why these certifications carry so much weight in the current market. They aren't valuable because they prove you can click buttons in a portal, but because they signal that you understand how to reduce complexity. You are proving that you view governance as an architectural requirement rather than a boring compliance checkbox to be dealt with later. The principle of constraint reduction explains why Microsoft experts find work so quickly. They solve the most expensive problems an enterprise faces, from security visibility gaps to the high cost of compliance friction. The professional who can remove these bottlenecks is the one who gets hired first, and they enter every negotiation knowing the enterprise needs them more than they need the job. Certification strategy SC100 as governance architecture. The SC100 is one of the most misunderstood credentials in the ecosystem. Most people mistake it for a security operations or tool-specific certification, but in reality, it is a governance architecture certification. The exam is designed to test your ability to build security strategies that span across identity, infrastructure, and applications in multi-cloud environments. This isn't just about knowing a lot of different things, it's about mastering systems thinking. The blueprint for the exam covers everything from designing access strategies with Entra ID to building security operations frameworks with Sentinel and Defender. It forces you to look at infrastructure security for hybrid environments and data protection through Purview, but the real value isn't found in the individual topics. The value is in the integration of those topics into a single functioning whole. The SC100 forces you to see how an identity decision in one area will inevitably ripple through your security operations and infrastructure. You have to understand how data security choices impact application development, which is the very definition of orchestration. You aren't being asked how to click through a conditional access menu, but how to design a zero-trust strategy that actually works across every layer of the stack. The market responds to this level of thinking with significant financial rewards. Professionals with the SC100 often earn between $130,000 and $180,000 a year in roles like cybersecurity architect. This represents a 20 to 30% pay bump over general security roles, largely because these individuals solve the most expensive architectural problems. They aren't just implementing a set of controls, they are designing the entire system. This creates a structural advantage during the hiring process. When a CISO asks a candidate to design a zero-trust strategy for a complex hybrid environment, the SC100 professional arrives with a proven framework. They can walk through the design, explain the necessary trade-offs, and predict the outcomes with a level of precision that others simply cannot match. They are demonstrating systems thinking in real time. A specialist in security operations usually lacks this holistic view. They might know Sentinel inside and out, and they might be great at incident response, but they often lack a framework for thinking about the entire architecture. They don't always see how identity serves as the foundation for everything else, or how to weave endpoint compliance into a coherent data protection model. The SC100 also serves as a signal that you have moved beyond just learning tools. It shows that you understand how architectural decisions propagate through a system, which is a rare and highly valuable trait. This is what the market is actually looking for when they post these high-paying architectural roles. The path to getting certified is intentionally difficult. You can't even sit for the SC100 without first proving your skills in identity, operations, or infrastructure through prerequisites like the SC300 or AZ500. This creates a high barrier to entry that prevents people from simply memorizing their way to a passing grade. You have to actually understand how these different domains integrate. The exam itself relies heavily on scenario-based questions where you are presented with a business problem and told to design a solution. You aren't being tested on your memory of product features, but on your ability to reason through an architectural challenge. This is exactly why the labor market places such a high value on the credential. The benefits of this certification go far beyond just a higher salary. Those who hold the SC100 are often moved into roles with more autonomy and a much larger scope of impact within the organization. They aren't stuck managing daily security operations. They are the ones designing the long-term strategy for the company. This is the fundamental shift from being a technician to becoming a true architect. For anyone in the middle of their career, the SC100 is the signal that you are ready for a principal or architect level role. It is the key that opens the door to strategic conversations with leadership and gives you immense leverage during a hire. You aren't just another applicant. You are someone who has proven they can reduce governance complexity and make security a deterministic part of the architecture. Certification strategy. MS-102 as identity and endpoint integration. Most organizations dismiss MS-102 as a basic entry-level certification for administrators. They are wrong. This exam is not about clicking through Microsoft 365 features or managing service health dashboards, but in reality, it is something else entirely. It is an evaluation of your ability to understand how identity and endpoint management integrate to create a secure environment. This is architectural thinking applied to the modern workplace, and that distinction matters. The blueprint for MS-102 covers tenant health and service management, yet focusing on those details misses the real value of the certification. The true test lies in understanding the interplay between Entra ID, conditional access, and multi-factor authentication. You are being asked to show how these tools integrate with Intune to manage devices and applications while simultaneously enforcing data compliance through Purview. Managing security through Defender is part of the job, but the foundational truth is that none of these domains exist in a vacuum. MS-102 evaluates your ability to see that identity is not separate from endpoint management, and endpoint management is not separate from data compliance. These are not independent silos. They are an integrated system where every policy choice has a ripple effect across the entire tenant. When you define an identity policy in Entra, it dictates what an endpoint can access, just as an Intune compliance policy determines who can touch sensitive data. This is systems thinking in its purest form, and it is exactly what the exam is testing. The labor market recognizes this architectural depth, which is why certified professionals often earn between $100,000 and $150,000 annually. This represents a 15 to 25% premium over IT professionals who lack the credential. But the money isn't just for being smarter. It is a payment for understanding the modern workplace as a single integrated system rather than a collection of disconnected toggles. The hiring advantage is operational and becomes obvious during the interview process. When a chief information officer looks for a Microsoft 365 administrator, they often ask how a candidate would deploy Copilot while maintaining security and compliance. This is not a question about licensing or seat counts. It is an architectural integration question. Deploying Copilot requires identity governance to manage access, endpoint compliance to ensure device health, and data protection to keep sensitive information from leaking into AI interactions. An MS-102 certified professional understands the question because they know that a Copilot rollout is an architectural decision that touches every corner of the tenant. They can design a deployment that actually enables productivity without letting governance erode, and they can explain the trade-offs to leadership before the first license is assigned. They aren't just guessing at the configuration, they are predicting the outcomes of the system. A non-certified professional might focus on how many licenses the company needs to buy, but the architect focuses on how to enable the tool within a governance framework. That is the hiring differentiator that the market is actually paying for today. MS-102 signals that you understand security is not a constraint on productivity, but rather the very thing that makes productivity possible. When you have strong identity governance, your users can work from anywhere, and when you have endpoint compliance, you can finally enable a secure BYOD strategy. The professional who understands this integration is rare, and as a result, they are usually the first ones hired. While the prerequisites are minimal and the exam is accessible for mid-career professionals, you should not mistake that accessibility for simplicity. The exam is comprehensive and requires a massive breadth of knowledge across identity, endpoints, data, and security. You must understand the modern workplace as a system to pass, and that understanding carries over into your career trajectory. MS-102 certified professionals are frequently promoted into principal administrator positions or architect roles because they aren't just managing services anymore. They are designing the identity and endpoint strategies that the entire business relies on. For a mid-career IT professional, this certification signals that you are ready for strategic conversations about system integration. It demonstrates that you understand the modern workplace as an architectural problem rather than a collection of independent technologies. This gives you massive leverage in hiring conversations because you have proven you can build a coherent framework. You are no longer just an admin. You are the person who ensures the system behaves as intended. Certification strategy, PL600 as process governance architecture. PL600 is easily the least understood certification in the Microsoft ecosystem. Most people dismiss it as a simple low-code credential or something meant for business users who want to build basic apps. They are wrong. PL600 is a governance architecture certification that evaluates your ability to design Power Platform solutions that scale across thousands of users. It is about maintaining security and operational coherence in an environment full of citizen developers. The exam blueprint involves designing solutions with Power Apps, Power Automate, and Copilot Studio, but the real challenge is the governance framework behind them. You have to design environment segregation, data loss prevention policies, and application lifecycle management that actually works at scale. This includes designing the data architecture for Dataverse and ensuring that security is enforced through role-based access and audit trails. The value is not in knowing the features, it is in understanding how to prevent architectural erosion. Power Platform enables citizen development, but that freedom creates massive governance complexity for the enterprise. The professional who can design a framework that allows people to build tools without creating conditional chaos is incredibly rare. The labor market values this skill, with PL600 certified professionals earning between $110,000 and $160,000 a year. This is a 30% premium over standard developers because the market needs architects, not just builders. The hiring advantage here is strategic rather than tactical. When a chief digital officer asks how to enable 500 citizen developers without creating a security nightmare, the PL600 professional has a ready answer. They can design a center of excellence model and explain how strict governance actually enables speed rather than restricting it. They demonstrate that citizen development is not a workaround for professional coding, but a legitimate architectural approach to solving business problems. A developer without this certification usually lacks that broader framework. They might understand how to build a complex Power Automate workflow, but they don't know how to manage 500 of them without creating compliance risks. They see governance as a hurdle to be cleared, whereas the architect sees governance as the foundation that allows the platform to move fast. PL600 signals that you understand low code as a serious architectural strategy. The professional who realizes that governance and speed are not opposites is the one who gets hired first in the enterprise space. The certification is challenging because it demands a massive breadth of knowledge across Canvas apps, model-driven apps, and desktop flows. You have to understand how Dataverse integrates with reporting in Power BI and how Copilot Studio automates the entire stack. This breadth is intentional because it ensures you understand how every component in the system integrates with the others. The exam is scenario-based, meaning you aren't just memorizing features, you are solving business problems and demonstrating architectural reasoning. This is why the labor market puts such a high price on the credential. It proves you can think about scalability and organizational adoption as a system. The impact of this certification extends to the very nature of your work. PL600 certified professionals are not hired to build individual apps. They are hired to architect the entire platform for the organization. They are the ones designing the governance frameworks that scale, enabling a total digital transformation instead of just fixing one broken process. For a mid-career professional, PL600 is the signal that you are ready for a solution architect role. It opens the door to strategic conversations about how a business operates and gives you leverage in any hiring negotiation. You have proven that you understand systems thinking and can manage the entropy that comes with a distributed development model. You understand process governance as an architectural concern, and you know that the market is paying for the person who can scale the platform without sacrificing security. The orchestration layer, how certifications align with architecture. The three certifications, SC100, MS102, and PL600, are not independent credentials, and they do not represent three separate career paths. In reality, they form a coherent architecture of governance that functions as three layers of one integrated system. SC100 represents security architecture, and it defines the overarching strategy through zero-trust principles and risk-based access control. This is the top layer where high-level security decisions are made, and it is where you answer the fundamental question of what secure actually means for the enterprise. MS102 focuses on identity and endpoint architecture, which serves as the middle layer where identity decisions are enforced through Entra ID and Intune. This is the foundation where you implement policy enforcement and threat detection to answer whether a specific user and their device can be trusted. PL600 is the process governance layer, and it enables business automation within the Power Platform while respecting the security policies inherited from the layers above. This is the bottom layer where business processes are automated, and it answers how to enable rapid innovation without sacrificing compliance or security. The integration of these layers is critical because a security policy defined in SC100 must be implemented in MS102 and then inherited by PL600. When you decide that sensitive data cannot be accessed from non-compliant devices, that policy is enforced through conditional access and respected by every Power App in the stack. This is deterministic governance, which means you have one policy and three enforcement points that produce consistent outcomes across the entire environment. The professional who understands this integration has a structural hiring advantage because they do not see three separate certifications, but rather one coherent governance architecture. When they walk into an interview, they can explain that identity is the control plane and security is the enforcement layer, which makes process automation the business enablement layer. These systems must integrate, and that kind of systems thinking is rare enough that it is what the market is actually paying for. The certification sequence matters, so you should start with MS102 to understand the identity and endpoint foundation. You cannot understand security architecture without knowing how identity works, and you certainly cannot understand process governance without knowing how endpoints are managed. MS102 is the foundation that makes the rest of the stack possible. Then you pursue SC100 to understand security architecture, which allows you to design strategies that leverage that identity foundation. Now you understand how to make security deterministic through architectural choices, and you can see how security integrates with identity, operations, infrastructure, and data. Finally, you pursue PL600 to understand how governance enables process automation within a secure framework. Now you understand how to enable citizen development without creating chaos, and you can scale innovation systematically without sacrificing the governance you built in the previous steps. This progression mirrors the architectural layers of foundation, enforcement, and enablement, where each layer assumes the one before it is already in place. But the real value is not in the sequence, because the real value is in understanding the integration between these domains. A professional with all three certifications understands that identity decisions affect security, and security decisions affect process automation, which ultimately dictates governance complexity. This is orchestration thinking, and it is what separates hired professionals from rejected resumes. The labor market rewards this understanding with a salary premium of 30 to 50% over a professional with only one certification. This does not happen because 3 certifications are 3 times better, but because the professional demonstrates they understand how governance integrates across the entire stack. This integration is why the Microsoft professional is hired faster, as they do not need to learn on the job how these domains interact. They can walk into a complex governance problem and immediately see the architecture, which allows them to propose coherent solutions and predict outcomes. They understand governance as a system rather than a collection of independent technologies, and that understanding is the orchestration layer where the 3 certifications become one framework. Portfolio strategy, building proof of orchestration thinking. Certifications are necessary but not sufficient, because the labor market rewards credentials only when they are paired with demonstrated orchestration thinking. The way to prove this is through portfolio artifacts that show you have designed governance systems at scale, which proves you can think rather than just pass an exam. The first artifact is a reference conditional access framework that documents the policies you would implement for different risk profiles. You should explain the business rationale and technical implementation for low-risk employees, medium-risk contractors, and high-risk users attempting to access sensitive data. For each policy, you must explain the expected outcomes and the friction it creates, because every security choice involves a trade-off that you must be able to justify. This artifact demonstrates systems thinking by showing that you do not just implement policies, but you actually design them with an understanding of the balance between security and user friction. The goal is to create the right friction in the right place, and the professional who understands this balance is rare in today's market. The second artifact is a zero-trust architecture diagram that maps the identity control plane and the security enforcement layer. You need to show how Entra ID acts as the source of authority and how every access request flows through identity verification and device compliance checks. Map the endpoint layer through Intune and the application layer, where data is protected based on identity context, then show how a single user request flows through each of these layers. This demonstrates that you understand how the layers integrate to grant or deny access based on the complete context of the request. The third artifact is a Power Platform governance design that documents the environment model and role-based access controls. You should detail the DLP policies and approval workflows that allow an app to move from development to production safely. This artifact proves that you understand governance as enablement rather than restriction, and it shows you can foster citizen development without creating architectural erosion. The fourth artifact is a licensing optimization playbook that documents how you would audit an enterprise's tools to identify overlaps and gaps. You should show the financial model of consolidating into a Microsoft stack, but more importantly, you must show the architectural benefits like governance, coherence, and operational efficiency. This demonstrates that you understand business outcomes and that the market is paying for the reduction of constraints rather than just cost savings. The fifth artifact is an incident response integration design that shows how you would unify Sentinel, Defender, and Entra logs into one workflow. You need to document how an incident is detected, investigated, and resolved through deterministic architectural choices. This proves that you understand security operations as a system where signals are correlated to produce a predictable response. These artifacts should be published as GitHub repositories or LinkedIn articles to signal your thinking to hiring managers. When a manager reviews your profile, they should see evidence that you have designed governance systems and that you understand how to reduce complexity across domains. That evidence is what gives you leverage in a hiring conversation and proves you are worth the premium. The sixth artifact is a migration narrative that documents how you would move an organization from fragmented identity systems to Entra ID. You should detail the phases from discovery to decommissioning legacy systems like Okta, and you must calculate the outcomes in terms of cost savings and security improvements. This demonstrates that you have handled this complexity before and that you can predict the outcomes of a major architectural shift. The seventh artifact is an AI governance framework that documents how you would handle AI agent identities and audit their decision-making. You should explain the policies that prevent rogue agents from accessing sensitive data and the isolation mechanisms required to keep the system secure. This shows that you are thinking ahead to the next major constraint, which gives you immense credibility in conversations about the future of the enterprise. These artifacts form a narrative that says you have designed governance systems at scale and moved organizations from reactive to deterministic models. That narrative is what opens doors and commands leverage because it proves you have solved the constraints that enterprises face every day. The portfolio strategy is not about perfection, but rather about demonstrating the way you reason through complexity. A well-documented governance design or a thoughtful architecture diagram is more valuable than a resume full of job titles and certifications. The market is paying for thought, and while credentials signal you passed an exam, your portfolio proves you can actually do the work. The hiring conversation: how to leverage your architecture thinking. Let's look at how this architectural mindset fundamentally changes the hiring conversation. Most candidates walk into an interview hoping to be picked for a job, but you are doing something else entirely. You are entering a high-stakes discussion about governance complexity. The person across the table has a problem that costs millions of dollars and ruins their sleep, and you are the one walking in with the structural solution. That is where your leverage comes from. The process begins with silence. As the hiring manager describes their environment, you listen for the symptoms of architectural erosion. They might mention 5 separate identity systems, repeated compliance failures, or security incidents that require weeks of digital archaeology just to understand. They have shadow IT, overlapping tools, and a compliance staff that spends an entire quarter just preparing for a single audit. Their security team cannot correlate signals because the infrastructure team operates in a complete vacuum. You do not interrupt them with a sales pitch or a list of features. Instead, you listen until you understand their specific constraints, because this isn't a generic industry problem. This is their specific brand of governance fog. When you finally speak, you frame the issue through the lens of system behavior. You tell them that while every environment is unique, the underlying architectural failure is always the same. Multiple identity systems do not just create extra work, they create a total lack of a source of truth. When you have 5 systems, you effectively have 0. Every access decision happens in isolation, every policy is enforced inconsistently, and every audit becomes a manual scavenger hunt. The solution is never to buy another tool to sit on top of the mess. You explain that the goal is consolidation, where Entra ID becomes the sole source of authority and everything else is federated into it. This is not a simple lift and shift operation. It is a fundamental architectural restructuring that requires mapping every workload to identity policies and defining exactly what compliant means for their specific organization. You are proposing a system that respects governance while actually allowing the business to move faster. The outcomes of this approach are deterministic and measurable. Access-related incidents will drop, and the time wasted on audit preparation will vanish. When a user is disabled in Entra, their access is revoked everywhere simultaneously, without exception. You are not selling a Microsoft product. You are selling the elimination of complexity. You are selling a world where compliance is a continuous state, rather than a quarterly scramble. They are buying the ability to know with absolute certainty who has access to what at any given second. That is the value that gets you hired. As the conversation deepens, they will test your boundaries. They might ask how you would handle their AWS workloads, and you will explain the reality of federated identity. Entra ID acts as the identity provider, while AWS IAM serves as the policy engine. Identity comes from one place, but authorization is distributed. This is a consistent architectural integration rather than a bolted-on workaround. When they ask about the timeline, you provide phases based on the physics of implementation rather than a guess. You know from experience that inventory takes 3 weeks, the pilot takes 4, and the production rollout takes 8. Add 4 weeks for decommissioning and another 4 for stabilization, and you have a 5-month roadmap. Your credibility comes from the fact that you have seen these timelines play out before. Then you do the math for them. You explain that cutting audit prep from 8 weeks to 4 frees up 3 weeks of the security team's time, which saves roughly $50,000 in loaded costs. If you reduce access incidents by 40% and each investigation costs $10,000, you just saved another $100,000. If you can kill a $300,000 Okta license, the direct savings hit $500,000 before you even count operational efficiency. You are showing them that you understand business outcomes, not just technical buttons. You are solving an expensive problem and they hire you because you have proven you can navigate their constraints. That is how you command the room. But the truly elite professionals do one more thing. After the meeting, you don't send a generic thank you note. You send a 1-page preliminary design. You show them what their Entra ID consolidation would look like, including the environment model, the DLP strategy, and the conditional access framework. You aren't asking for a job anymore. You are showing them that you've already started solving their problem because you couldn't help yourself. That follow-up converts an interview into an offer because it proves you don't need them to hire you. You've already hired yourself. Why entry-level professionals struggle? The constraint problem. The reason entry-level professionals struggle in the Microsoft market is often uncomfortable to hear. It isn't a lack of intelligence or effort. They struggle because they do not yet understand how to solve for constraints. They see a job description, study the tools, and pass the exam, but they still face a wall of rejections. They are rejected because they haven't yet proven they can turn governance fog into architectural clarity. They haven't taken a chaotic compliance environment and replaced it with a deterministic model. They haven't consolidated 5 systems into one or stripped millions of dollars out of an operational budget. They are smart, but they haven't yet solved an expensive problem, so the market doesn't know how to value them. This sounds harsh, but the market does not pay for potential. It pays for the proven reduction of complexity. It pays for the person who can walk into a room and point to a history of improved compliance and saved money. Entry-level professionals cannot claim that leverage yet, so they don't get the high-level roles they want. Instead, they start as junior administrators or support engineers. They implement the controls that architects have already designed and execute the playbooks that experts have already written. They aren't making the big architectural decisions yet. They are the ones making those decisions a reality. This is the necessary entry point into the ecosystem. This isn't a failure of the system, it's simply how expertise is built. You prove yourself at one level before moving to the next. You do the junior work to learn the domain and see how constraints actually function in the real world. You start documenting what you do, building a portfolio, and showing that you understand the why behind the how. The biggest mistake new professionals make is trying to skip these levels. They want to design complex governance systems without ever having implemented a single policy. They want to reduce complexity without ever having lived through the chaos that creates it. Real expertise requires the friction of experience, and that only comes from doing the work at every stage of the journey. The path forward is actually very clear. You take the first role you can get, whether it's a junior admin or a support desk position, and you do excellent work. You document every lesson and start building artifacts for your portfolio. You create a conditional access design based on what you're seeing in the field, or you write a narrative about an incident you helped investigate. You start demonstrating that you are thinking, not just clicking. While you do this, you pursue the MS-102. You will actually use the material in your daily tasks, which gives you the context to turn that knowledge into a foundation. You'll pass the exam with actual credibility because you've seen the concepts in action. Spend a year at that level. Build your evidence, document your growth. When you eventually apply for mid-level roles, you won't just have a certification, you'll have a portfolio. You'll be able to say that you've done the work, you understand the trade-offs, and you know how the constraints actually feel. This is the only realistic path to authority. It isn't a straight line from certifications to a high-paying role. It is a path from experience to roles where certifications simply prove what you've already seen. That is how you build the leverage required to command a hiring conversation and become the professional that enterprises are desperate to hire. The path forward. Why 2026 and 2027 are inflection points. The market is currently undergoing a fundamental shift as AI automates routine tasks and cloud operations grow increasingly dense. Governance demands are intensifying alongside accelerating regulatory pressures, which means that by 2026, enterprises will require fewer junior infrastructure engineers and far more governance architects. We are seeing the industry move away from a focus on infrastructure speed toward a requirement for governance coherence. This shift represents your primary opportunity. The professionals who will hold the most value in 2026 and 2027 are those who recognize that AI agents are not merely chatbots. In architectural terms, these agents are identities that possess specific access rights and permissions, meaning they require the same rigorous governance and auditing as any human user. You must actually govern them more strictly because an AI agent accesses data at machine speed and can execute thousands of requests per second. Since an agent can exfiltrate data faster than any human ever could, the resulting governance requirement is enormous. High demand in 2026 will follow the professional who understands AI agent governance and can design identity frameworks that treat these agents as first-class identities. This individual will be the one who builds conditional access policies for AI workloads, audits automated decision-making, and prevents AI from bypassing established guardrails. When the hiring cycle begins, that specific architect will be the first one signed. This architectural shift is exactly why certifications like SC100, MS102, and PL600 will be so valuable in 2026. These paths teach you to view governance as architecture, which is critical because AI governance is the next great architectural challenge. If you already understand identity governance, you are not starting from zero because you already grasp the frameworks and constraints. Your task is simply to extend those existing principles to AI agents. The path forward is clear. You must pursue the certifications, build the portfolio, and do the work required to demonstrate your thinking. By 2026, when enterprises are panicking over how to control their AI agents, you will be the rare professional who actually understands the underlying architecture. You will be able to walk into a hiring conversation and explain that you have designed identity frameworks at scale and know exactly how to extend them to solve the AI problem. This expertise gives you leverage, allowing you to command premium salaries and have your choice of roles. That is the specific opportunity 2026 presents, but the window to prepare is closing. You have to understand the architecture now, because by the time the demand peaks, the professionals who started thinking about AI governance back in 2024 will be the ones holding all the cards. The market reality. Why Microsoft professionals command premium compensation. We should be direct about the financial reality of this career path. A Microsoft architect holding an SC100 certification with proven experience in governance consolidation typically earns between $150,000 and $225,000 annually. Compare that to a cloud generalist with the same years of experience who earns between $120,000 and $160,000. That distinction matters because it represents a 15 to 40% premium, which adds up to over $1 million in extra earnings over a 10-year career. This premium exists because the Microsoft professional is tasked with solving a much more expensive problem for the enterprise. Governance complexity costs companies millions in operational overhead, security incidents, and compliance violations that often stem from audit failures or vendor sprawl. When a professional reduces this complexity by even 30%, they save the organization millions of dollars, and the market naturally compensates them for that value. An AWS architect might be equally skilled or experienced, but they are ultimately solving a different set of problems like infrastructure speed and cost optimization. While those are valuable goals, they are rarely as expensive as the fallout from governance complexity. You can rebuild infrastructure and restore data, but you cannot undo a compliance violation or hide a failed audit. Because governance complexity compounds over time, the professional who can resolve it commands much higher compensation. Enterprises operate with limited budgets and will always allocate the largest portion of those funds to their most expensive headaches. Since governance complexity is a massive financial drain, they hire architects and pay premium salaries to keep the system under control. The AWS architect receives a budget for infrastructure optimization, while the Microsoft architect receives a budget for governance consolidation, and those budgets are never equal because the problems are not equally costly. This financial gap is exactly why mid-career professionals should shift their focus toward Microsoft architecture. You will earn more and enjoy better job security while maintaining more leverage in every hiring conversation you enter. This isn't because the Microsoft platform is inherently better, but because Microsoft architecture solves the most expensive problems an enterprise faces, and the market is designed to pay for that resolution. Orchestration as business capability, the final truth. Let me bring this back to a fundamental principle that most engineers ignore. Enterprises do not hire professionals because they want to fill a seat, but because they are actually buying capabilities. They buy the capability to collapse governance complexity into something manageable. They buy the capability to migrate from 5 disconnected identity systems into one single source of truth. These organizations are paying for the move from manual, soul-crushing audits to continuous compliance, and they are investing in the shift from incident response, archaeology, to real-time detection. The Microsoft professional who understands the market sells these capabilities rather than individual tools. They do not sell implementations or simple configurations because they are selling orchestration and systems thinking. They sell the rare ability to see how disparate domains integrate to reduce overall complexity. That is what the market is actually buying at a premium. That specific insight is what commands high compensation and gives you real leverage during a hiring conversation. This distinction is what separates the elite Microsoft professional from the AWS specialist or the generalist cloud engineer. The Microsoft professional recognizes that governance is the ultimate constraint on any business. They have built a portfolio that proves they think in terms of governance, and they have pursued certifications that signal they understand how systems interact. When they walk into a hiring conversation, they aren't begging for a job because they are offering to solve millions of dollars in architectural debt. That is a fundamentally different conversation than asking for a paycheck. This reality will only become more intense as we move toward 2026 and beyond. As AI agents proliferate and regulatory pressures accelerate, the professional who understands orchestration will become the most valuable asset in the room. The market will not look for the specialist who only knows one narrow domain. It will look for the orchestrator who understands how to weave identity, security, endpoints, and data into one coherent system. That professional gets hired first, they command the most leverage, and they end up with the career you actually want. This is the uncomfortable truth that most people in this industry completely miss. The market does not reward deep specialization in a vacuum, but it rewards orchestration. It does not reward tool expertise, but it rewards systems thinking. Most importantly, the market does not reward the certifications themselves, but it rewards the orchestration thinking that those certifications represent when backed by a real portfolio. If you have internalized this reality, then you have already made a strategic decision to stop competing for commodity roles. By committing to the SC100, MS102, and PL600 while building actual governance artifacts, you are choosing to solve the most expensive problems a company has. You have decided to become the professional that enterprises hunt for. You are no longer just another cloud engineer lost in the stack. You are an orchestrator, and that is the only market position that matters. That is why these professionals are hired faster and earn significantly more over the life of their careers. The architectural advantage is not about Microsoft. Here is the final insight that ties this entire strategy together. The reason Microsoft professionals get hired faster is not actually because Microsoft tools are inherently better than the competition. AWS has capable tools, Google Cloud has capable tools, and Okta has a capable platform. The reason is purely architectural. The Microsoft stack is built to make governance deterministic, where identity acts as the central control plane and everything else orbits around it. This creates a coherent model that other stacks simply struggle to match. But the real insight goes even deeper than the technology itself. The true market advantage belongs to the professionals who can reduce governance complexity through orchestration. These people happen to work in the Microsoft ecosystem because that environment rewards systems thinking more than any other. The principle, however, is universal. Wherever governance complexity acts as the primary constraint on a business, orchestration thinking becomes the most valuable skill in the building. Wherever domains need to integrate to solve expensive problems, the architect is the one who gets paid. The Microsoft professional has simply found the ecosystem where this principle is most obvious to the business. They work where identity is the foundation and where every other system depends on that foundation to function. Because governance complexity is visible at every single layer of the Microsoft stack, the person who can manage it has an immediate advantage. That positioning is what creates the leverage that leads to being hired first. But you must understand that the principle matters far more than the platform you happen to be using today. If you internalize the idea that enterprises pay for the reduction of constraints, you can apply that logic anywhere. Governance complexity is expensive and orchestration thinking is both rare and valuable. Once you accept this, you become the architect that companies fight over. You can build a career where you are choosing between high-value offers instead of blindly applying for jobs. That is the actual advantage you are looking for. It is not about the certifications, the tools, or the specific platform. The advantage is recognizing that complexity has massive economic value to the person who can solve it. The professional who reduces that complexity at scale is extremely valuable to the bottom line. The Microsoft professional has simply recognized this reality sooner than everyone else and positioned themselves to solve the problem. If you want that career trajectory, the path is remarkably clear. You must accept that governance complexity is the constraint holding most enterprises back. You should pursue the certifications that signal you understand systems, and you must build the artifacts that prove you can orchestrate them. When you have hiring conversations, focus entirely on the expensive problem you are solving. When you do that, your leverage increases, your salary improves, and your options expand. You become the professional that the enterprise cannot afford to lose. This isn't about being the smartest person in the room or working more hours than your peers. This is about positioning. It is about orchestration thinking and understanding that the market does not reward tool mastery. The market rewards architects who can bring order to chaos. The Microsoft professional has recognized this shift, and that is why they are hired faster. That is the architectural advantage that the market will always favor. How to stay ahead of the market shift. This conversation has laid out the specific reason why the market favors Microsoft professionals and the exact path to position yourself inside that advantage. The logic is straightforward once you see it, but the execution requires sustained focus and the discipline to build your portfolio while you pursue the certifications. If you found this analysis useful, I want to ask for 3 specific things that will help both of us. First, follow me on LinkedIn at Mirko Peters. This isn't just a social media request, but a way to ensure you stay ahead of these market shifts as they happen. I am constantly monitoring hiring trends, watching how certifications change, and analyzing where the next governance bottleneck will appear. The insights I share there are exactly the early signals that let you position yourself before the market gets crowded. Send me a connection request. And more importantly, send me your questions about topics you want me to explore. If you are facing a specific governance challenge or you want me to break down an architectural decision, tell me what you need. The episodes we produce are driven by real professionals trying to solve real problems. Your input shapes the content. Second, share this podcast with your network. Not just the link, but tell people why it matters. Tell them that this isn't another surface-level tutorial on how to click buttons in a portal. This is a strategic analysis of the labor market and an explanation of why orchestration thinking is the only position that actually matters. If someone in your network is a mid-career professional wondering why they are not getting hired, or if they are staring at their resume and wondering what they are actually missing. This episode answers that question. Sharing this conversation is how we make sure the right people hear the right message at the right time. Third, leave a review. This is not vanity, but rather an algorithmic reality. When you leave a review on your podcast platform, you are telling the system that this content is worth promoting to other listeners. You are helping other professionals discover this episode without having to stumble across it by accident. A 5-star review with a brief note about why the episode mattered to you is how we ensure this analysis reaches the architects who actually need it. Take 2 minutes and do that because it multiplies the reach of this message far beyond what I could do alone. The market shift toward governance, complexity, and orchestration thinking is not happening in 2027. It is happening right now. The professionals who position themselves today will be the ones who command leverage in the hiring conversations that matter. Those who wait until the demand is obvious will be competing for leftover roles in a crowded field. The time to build your portfolio, pursue your certifications, and start thinking in terms of orchestration is now. Not someday, but actually now. Thank you for investing your time in this analysis. This conversation exists because people like you are willing to think deeply about how markets actually work and position yourselves accordingly. Stay relentless.